You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News, live from COP26 in Glasgow, where a reality check has been delivered to those trying to keep 1.5 alive. Scientists warn that even with all the target pledges made at the summit, the world is still headed for well over 2 degrees of warming. The focus here today has been on progressing gender equality, with women and girls making up 80% of those displaced by climate change.
And I'm live in the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro. We'll hear from one man creating an urban mangrove forest to help fight climate change. And the president, he says, does not care. In neighbouring Peru, we report from the melting glaciers, which could endanger the water supply of one of the driest capitals on Earth. While in India, Chennai is hit by flooding caused by unseasonal rain.
And back here in Scotland, we'll see how locally farmed seaweed is doing its bit to help mitigate the effects of climate change. Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show, live from COP26 in Glasgow, where the summit's president, Alok Sharma, has said progress is being made, but admitted there's still a mountain to climb. To help give negotiators the final push, Boris Johnson has said this evening that he'll come back here tomorrow, and this time by train. Well, his return comes after a bleak message from the scientists who've scrutinised what's been agreed so far. Analysis from the Climate Action Tracker has today suggested that existing pledges will reduce global warming by just a few tenths of a degree, raising serious concerns over the effort to keep 1.5 alive. Without further long-term pledges, global temperatures are instead forecasted to rise by 2.4 degrees by 2100, as our science editor Tom Clark reports.
Chennai is underwater again for the second time in 6 years. The intensity and frequency of monsoons is part of our changing climate. As India faces its impacts thousands of miles away, the world is running out of time to stop it.
If you look at the consequences of going higher in terms of what's going to happen to countries around the world, extreme weather events, sea rising, island nations that are really in trouble, some of them now. So 1.5 has to be the target. Is it achievable? Yes, but it's tough.
But action so far hasn't been enough. We now have the first analysis of how much of a difference last week's major announcements at COP26 will make. Pledges from phasing out coal to cutting methane and saving forests. The whole purpose of this summit is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. But because we might get to that point as early as the 2030s, this analysis looked at 2030 pledges. Combined, they take us well beyond 1.5 degrees of warming to 2.4 degrees by the end of the century. And even in a really optimistic scenario, which includes very shaky pledges like ending deforestation, we still get to 1.8 degrees of warming by 2100. On one level, it's great progress. We were facing 3 degrees of warming earlier this year. But it's shattering COP26 President Alok Sharma's bid to keep 1.5 alive.
Can you tell us in concrete terms what has to happen in the next few days to make sure this isn't the summit where 1.5 dies?
We are, of course, very clearly focused on ensuring that we are keeping 1.5 within reach. Where we get to is going to emerge through consensus. We'll have the cover decision going out overnight, and I'm sure there'll be questions on that as well during the press conference tomorrow.
The cover decision is the negotiating document that marks the beginning of the end game here. Outside, the demonstrations continued. Live to the reality, there are now just 3 days left to agree the plan to save the planet. They chose an obvious but entirely accurate metaphor. If these talks fail, we all go down together, whether you're in China, Chennai or the chilly Clyde. Tom Clark, Sky News, Glasgow.
So tomorrow we'll see the return of Boris Johnson, but so far this week has seen the return of the Americans. After 4 years of the Trump administration, the Democrats are keen to make their presence felt, with Barack Obama in town yesterday. And today our climate change correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter caught up with the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
How much does American leadership matter on this issue right now?
Well, enormously, because we're a leader of the world, and we have made a big commitment to change, and we're back in. It's unfortunate that the last 4 years, previous 4 years, were what they were.
I've ever done. I've done a lot of bad ones.
And Hannah's here with me now. So, Hannah, a show of force then from the Americans this week, but how much difference can they make?
Well, there is something about the American use of soft power, and it's back in force, as you say, this time around. Lots of administration representatives have spoken of this kind of lingering shame of the Donald Trump era, who, of course, pulled America out of the Paris Climate Accord. And there are some other domestic problems as well, though. Even though we've now moved on from Donald Trump, Joe Biden has had to preside over a real wrangling in Congress to get through some crucial climate change legislation, and some of it still hasn't passed. So there's a real awareness, I think, amongst the American contingent that they've staked an awful lot on the success of this big summit, while also they're dealing with problems at home. I caught up with one of the big stars of the American climate change movement, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and I asked her about whether or not, in the post-Trump era, the US has actually made a full recovery of its moral authority, and this is what she had to say.
No, we have not recovered our moral authority. I believe that we are making steps, but also kind of in reference to the earlier question, we have to actually deliver the action in order to get the respect and authority internationally, to get the credit. We have to draw down emissions to get credit for being committed on climate change. It's really that simple.
A really blunt assessment there, and an awful lot riding on getting that domestic agenda done. But they know that their focus has to be marshalling nations together at COP26 to get all of these complicated disagreements ironed out. And I think that is their focus right now, despite the problems at home. And that is why Boris Johnson is coming back to Glasgow tomorrow to see if he can, frankly, crack some heads together and get this done.
Hannah, thank you.
And good evening from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, a country, of course, so crucial in the fight against climate change. More from here in just a moment. But first, in neighbouring Peru, Sky News has been told that the country is on the edge of disaster with a deepening water crisis for which there is no plan. About 72% of the world's tropical glaciers are located in Peru. They're among the world's fastest retreating mountain ice caps. But scientists fear that many of the country's largest glaciers will have all but disappeared by the mid-2050s. Lima, also known as the desert capital, is one of the driest capital cities in the world. Without the water from glaciers, the city and the surrounding communities could face severe water scarcity. Well, our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, hiked up to the edge of Peru's receding Yanapacha Glacier in Cordillera Blanca mountain range, and he sent this report.
High in the Peruvian Andes. These mountains are home to huge glaciers that provide water for farming and drinking to millions across northern Peru. But they're literally melting away at an astonishing rate. 1/3 have gone in just 10 years. 72% of the world's tropical glaciers are here. They exist around the equator at altitudes above 4,000 meters. But because of their position on the equator, they're particularly sensitive to climate change. As the world warms, the glaciers retreat. You used to be able to drive to the glaciers in Peru. To see them now, you have to walk. Charlie Good has been here for 17 years. He took us to the Yanapacha Glacier at just under 5,000 meters. The changes to the mountains and its glaciers because of global warming are, he says, all too obvious to see.
You can see that massive rock slab which is now exposed. When I was here 17 years ago, or maybe even 15 years ago, that has receded all the way back, so a couple of 100 meters. And when I was actually up here in November a couple of years ago, we had there's meant to be one waterfall coming off that glacier. In November, when the sun's almost directly overhead because we're tropical, there were 9 waterfalls coming off it.
That means
it's absolutely brilliant. I mean, it's melting before your eyes. I mean, I was crying. I was filming a clip and just crying about how much water is coming off that glacier.
The melting waters from the glaciers fill huge lakes that in turn provide water further downstream. Too much water and they flood, and the water is lost.
Climate change and increasing temperatures hit this part of the world in the 1970s. Glaciers started melting. Now, it wasn't a disaster because huge amounts of water was released, went down the valleys and went eventually all the way to the deserts near the coast, where there was a farming bonanza because of the huge amount of water that was created. The problem is that water and that agriculture was dependent upon these glaciers, but they are melting at an incredible rate. And very soon, perhaps in the next 2 decades, there won't be any water. And those farms will all be in desert once again.
Across northern Peru, the glacial waters are directed into vast farms. Its produce exported worldwide. These are strawberries grown on the side of the mountain. Experts say that increasingly erratic climate conditions and the drop in glacial water is threatening these farms' existence.
But the water that comes...
One of the world's leading authorities on this is Cesar Portocarrero. He's been warning Peru and the world about the effects of climate change for 2 decades. Now, he says, we're on the edge of disaster.
We have to think in the new generation, not in us. We are going to live this nice world in some time in the near future, but we are leaving the problem, as James Hansen say, storms for our grandchildren. We are leaving the problem for them. And if we love them, we should work things now.
Lima is one of the world's driest capitals. It barely rains. Without the precious glacial water that is directed to the centre of town, it would all look like this. A desert with people struggling to live. Even the people on the edge of town depend on water channeled to them from the glaciers. Without the glaciers, there is no life. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, Peru.
Well, Rio de Janeiro, where I am now, is considered one of the more vulnerable cities in Latin America when it comes to climate change, vulnerable to rising temperatures, rising sea levels, and particularly to landslides destroying the shanty towns or favelas dotted on the hillsides around this city. But one biologist here who considers President Bolsonaro's policies a disaster for the planet is a one-man mission to confront global warming. In a swamp on the edge of Rio stands a biologist consumed by the fight against climate change and against a president he says doesn't care.
We have a strange president when the issue is the environment.
We're walking through Mario Moscatelli's passion project.
This ecosystem is very important.
He is working to create the biggest urban mangrove forest in Brazil.
This is one way to fight against the climate change. It's very, very important, these trees. This is a seedling of
seedling.
Yeah, seedling of the...
He's planted 3/4 of a square mile so far and is keeping going.
This is a new planting.
But it is not straightforward. The disastrous habits of man are taking their toll here.
We have tires, television, domestic garbage.
An unending tide of debris is just about kept at bay by an unstable fence, but it is unremitting and it is depressing. So this is your nightmare, yeah? You're trying to build. You're trying to build a new.
This is my dream, and here is nightmare. Yes.
Okay. Mario says it all means too much of their time here is spent doing this rather than planting trees. The cleanup is never ending. What we're witnessing here is quite incredible. One man and his team battling against pollution, battling against climate change. But you can see just what they're up against here. Further in we walk towards what his dream is all about.
Be careful, please.
This is, of course, tiny stuff when confronted with vast areas of rainforest being destroyed as I speak.
Difficult.
But these seedlings were planted last year and many, many more are planned by a man so desperate to change things here. at least some hope is taking root right now in Mario's mangrove. And there's much more from here in Brazil in the next hour, but now back to Anna in the studio.
Mark, thank you. Well, here in Scotland, an unusual natural product is increasingly being used to help fight climate change. In the search for clean energy, seaweed is now powering cars as well as making packaging. Our science correspondent Thomas Moore reports.
The clean, cold waters of Scotland's west coast. Perfect conditions for seaweed. And Peter Elborn is growing it on ropes below the surface.
Get to January, the light comes back, nutrients in the water come back. Everything is there ready for these seaweeds to start growing really fast, centimetres a day.
By May, when the seaweed is harvested to use in food products, it'll be 2 metres tall. And that growth helps mitigate climate change.
As seaweed grows, it's absorbing oceanic carbon. This year, we would expect it to be a relatively modest scale we're at the moment. So perhaps around half a tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent that we're absorbing from the ocean.
By some estimates, seaweed soaks up 5 times as much carbon as the same area of forest. Assessments of wild kelp suggest it absorbs more than 200 million tonnes of carbon globally.
When we talk about capturing carbon, we often think about planting trees, but trees take space on land that has a myriad of other uses. Out here, there's no such competition. The seaweed here provides a habitat for fish and it cleans up the water. It is a win-win for the environment.
But the environmental benefits are a happy coincidence. The driver for farming is seaweed's growing range of uses. In its Oban lab, Oceanium can extract protein, fibre and minerals. It's making a compostable bioplastic for packaging. And in future, seaweed could even replace oil as a source of building blocks for the chemical industry.
You've got very cold habitats, very hot habitats. You've got some quite extreme environments. And seaweed occupies all of those niches. So it's solved a lot of chemical and physical problems to survive. And that creates a diversity of chemistry and products that we can use and develop into things that solve our problems.
Seaweed farming doesn't let us off making huge reductions to greenhouse gas emissions, but the carbon it captures could help the world reach net zero. Thomas Moore, Sky News, in Oban.
Well, let's talk now about what's been going on today in Glasgow with Judy Ling Wong, Honorary President of the Black Environment Network, and Amber Rudd, who was Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change at Paris in 2015. So welcome to both of you. So much to talk about. Judy, today has been Gender Day. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But Amber, I'm interested to hear from you, your reaction to the news that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is returning to Glasgow tomorrow. I mean, what hope that he could galvanise progress? Is he in a position to make a difference, do you think?
Well, at least he's acknowledged that this is probably the most important thing that is going on at the moment, not only in the UK, but in the world. So the fact that he's prioritising it is good news. And let's face it, he always makes an impression. So I hope it'll be a positive impression and people will feel additional obligation to really arrive at a compromise and an ambitious text at the end of this week. I think it's only good news. I mean, in Paris, Laurent Fabius came at the end as well. Sorry, François Hollande, who was the Prime Minister, who was the President, came at the end as well, because Laurent Fabius was the Alok Sharma equivalent then. And it does help. It shows that it's a real priority for the host country. So I hope it's going to be helpful to getting that elusive agreement.
Is it a sign he's worried?
He should be worried. We're all worried. We're all worried whether we're actually going to get a final text that is ambitious and that actually delivers on the hope that we all have. So I think being worried is the right place to be at the moment.
And I'm just going to bring in our data dashboard, if that's OK, because this summit is all about keeping the prospect of 1.5 alive, keeping global warming capped at 1.5. I don't know if we can see where we're at now, but there's where we're at the moment, just over 1.2 degrees at the moment. So there's a tough mission ahead, and we've had analysis from from Climate Action Tracker today, suggesting that we're not heading for 1.5. Temperature rises will top 2.4 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, based on the short-term goals that the countries have set out. It doesn't look good, does it?
No, it is very worrying. I mean, just to remind ourselves, though, in Paris 6 years ago, we were at about 4. So there has been a lot of progress, but, you know, it is terrifying to think that the climate could rise over 2 degrees, which is why we should all be worried and ambitious to try to get an agreement. These are really sobering, worrying numbers, which I hope will help to galvanise the politicians who are here doing the negotiations over the text to real action, because I know that everybody's worried.
Judy Ling Wong, let's talk about what today's focus was here at COP. Part of the session was devoted to science and innovation, but the other part was gender, and I think you've been involved in some of the discussions. Tell us why you think it's so important that we address this issue. I mean, we're told, aren't we, that women are disproportionately affected by climate change?
Yes, they are. This is very worrying, but, you know, all disadvantaged communities are sick and tired of being told that they're the people who need to adapt and be resilient. They want the problem fixed. Let's not have to adapt and be resilient. The whole point is that women make up half of the world's population, and we are a force that can be switched on, especially in the front of green jobs. You can switch on the contribution by women so that it actually accelerates social and economic development in every single country. And the way you do this is really, really fundamental. You need to put women in positions of power, not influence. There's a huge rising generation of activists who are women, but they're not power wielders. So what we're demanding as women is that we want 50% presence on all decision-making structures, from the lowest to the highest, so that we are part of the power structure.
And what do you think about this COP? Have women's voices been heard enough, do you think?
You know, at the sessions where it's all women, like the session I was in today about gender-sensitive transitions, the voices are strong and clear, but we need to be in all panels where the power is, and this is the real issue. We want to be there wielding power and not just influencing with our voices. Our voices are loud and clear.
And Amber, you criticised the UK team, didn't you, for not having enough women on it?
Have they taken agree more with Judy? It's such an important distinction. There are lots of women here who are campaigning, who are leading campaigning, who are the biggest voices, pointing out that women's voices need to be heard and their lives taken more seriously. But in the decision-making, there are nowhere near enough. What I would like to see is that the UN to say that all delegations should be 50% women. I have criticised the UK team. We should have many more women on the front of them, because they are the country who are hosting it, so they lead by example. They're leading by example on carbon reduction, but not in gender equality.
What was the reaction, by the way?
It wasn't wholly welcomed, I have to say, but it doesn't stop us, does it, Judy?
No, it doesn't.
Keep on shouting about it.
And do you think that the message has got through that women are most vulnerable to climate change, and that needs to be addressed?
That message is really strong here, and it has got through. But I'm more interested in where there are special opportunities to push. And as I said, if women can get access to green jobs, we are a force. And women can help make decisions on the route to green jobs so that it is really successful and transforms the social and economic development of single countries.
Well, you were one woman on the UK delegation team for COP15 in Paris, which of course ended up with that hugely successful Paris Agreement. So you know what it's like to be at a COP and witness success. So does this have the same feeling about it, COP26?
The COP in Paris also was very worrying. It was also very anxious making. You know, we didn't know until the last minute we were actually going to get an agreement. And in the end, a more ambitious agreement than we had hoped for, because it wasn't just limiting increasing climate to 2 degrees, but keeping 1.5 in reach. And now everybody talks about 1.5. So you won't know till the last minute. And I have a message for everybody here who is supporting other people around these discussions, is it won't necessarily end on time. They do often go on for a couple of days, as ours did. But I think this feels that it is a worrying moment. But I hope with the Prime Minister arriving and other people getting anxious about it, it will actually galvanise some action, because, boy, do we need an agreement.
And very briefly, Judy, how optimistic do you feel?
I would be optimistic if the women start getting into power wielding, because we come from a culture of caring, which means that we are about integrated policy, bringing together social, cultural, environmental and economic outcomes. And if we get in there and put the detail in, we will make these programs succeed.
OK, Judy Ling Wong, a strong message there. And to you, Amber Rods, thank you both.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Don't forget, you can listen to a new Climate Cast every day, and you can watch our pop-up channel, if you're not watching it already, Climate Live on channel 525. Thanks for watching.